Good evening, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby-Sims, the Executive Director at the Institute of Politics. It is our pleasure this evening to welcome Tatiana Schlossberg to campus for a conversation with Robinson Meyer of The Atlantic. Special thanks to our partners at International House for making this program possible, and to the Energy Policy Institute at UChicago for hosting Robinson Meyer as a visiting fellow this quarter. Ms. Schlossberg's new book, Inconspicuous Consumption: The Environmental Impact You Didn't Know You Have, is going to be available for sale after the program, and she'll be signing copies if you'd like. I do want to mention a few upcoming events. Tomorrow, Rick Stengel, former managing editor of Time Magazine and former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, will be at the IOP to discuss fake news and fighting disinformation in the 21st century. Next Tuesday, 8-time NBA All-Star and humanitarian Dikembe Mutombo will come to the IOP to speak on his philanthropic efforts in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. If you're interested in hearing more from Robinson, on Wednesday, November 6th, EPIC will be hosting a panel of renowned national security and policy experts for a conversation on the intersection of energy policy and national security. The best way to stay in touch with us and hear about all of our upcoming events is at our website at politics.uchicago.edu, where you can sign up for our newsletter. As usual, we will have questions after our conversation. There will be 2 microphones, 1 in each aisle, and everybody is welcome at the mic. We especially are encouraging students to come up. We reserve priority for the first 3 questions for students. We remind you that questions are brief and end in question marks. And we'd like to ask you to make sure that your phones are on silent at this time. And now to formally introduce our speakers is Perrin Davidson. Perrin is a second year from Freeport, Maine, studying physics and statistics. He is highly engaged in environmental issues here on campus. In fact, as part of an IOP Civic Learning Grant, he started an environmental organization called the Chicago Environmental Leadership Initiative. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
As climate activist Greta Thunberg summed it up, our house is on fire. It's a bleak statement, but it's a true statement. Some of us might unpack this as an extreme rhetoric, while others might be raised to action. And while in theory the latter implies we need some sort of systemic change to put out this literal fire raging around the world, unfortunately most of us lose our way from the start. Because even the smallest, the most inconspicuous of human actions have unprecedented impacts on our environment, regardless of how many green activities we might take. So we're all in this sort of dilemma. Is our individual action, no matter how great, outweighed by this butterfly effect of unchecked consumerism? Or is there some sort of roadmap that we can all, and importance needs to be placed on the collective all here, follow to ensure we properly navigate and successfully engage in the daunting task of reversing the roaring fire of the current climate crisis? So these are questions that I think about a lot, and I'm sure that you all do as well. So I'm excited tonight to introduce writer Tatiana Schlossberg, who will be able to shed light on this elusive path and inform our future decisions towards a more environmental and equitable world. So Ms. Schlossberg is a journalist who has written about climate change and the environment for the climate and science sections of the New York Times. She just released her book, Inconspicuous Consumption: The Environmental Impact You Don't Know You Have. Tonight she is in conversation with visiting fellow in journalism at the Energy Policy Institute at UChicago, Robinson Meyer, who also writes about climate change and technology for The Atlantic. So with Mrs. Schlossberg's expertise and systems-based way of thinking environmentally, we can all learn a lot and be inspired by our conversation their conversation that they will have tonight. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Robinson Meyer and Tatiana Schlossberg.
And thank you for having us. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So it's so funny reading the book. I'm going to put a hypothesis here. We're both science writers. We can do it. It's amazing. Reading the book, I thought I was kind of noticing something. The book seemed to me to react to something that I had gone through too as an environmental reporter, which is you kind of get into it, you're concerned about the environment, and you start to look around, and you realize every segment of your life, segments that you didn't even think of having a kind of foot in environmental problems actually do, and actually are kind of what's driving the whole issue. So let me now test that hypothesis and say, is that right? And what motivated the book overall? Like, how did you go from being a reporter to?
Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm always amazed that people I don't know want to listen to me talk, so it's very nice for you to be here. Yeah, I think that's, before I started writing about climate change and the environment as a science reporter, I felt like I never wanted to read about it because it made me so upset. And I found that actually when I became a reporter, as I learned more, it wasn't that the problem seemed less serious and less scary, but I felt kind of more, I felt like I understood the world around me, and that I was a kind of more informed and responsible citizen because I understood how my life interacted with the climate crisis. And part of that was kind of learning about all these different impacts that I write about in the book. But also, I felt like I wanted to write the book because I was frustrated by kind of the scale of the conversation about climate change, which was especially kind of this aspect of it, which was, either it's a plastic straw or it's a complete transformation of the electricity grid in 10 years. And I felt like there had to be something kind of in between those two things that would make it not only kind of relevant and relatable, but also help people to understand why we are all involved in this, and that it's not just those two abstract things which feel abstract. Energy feels abstract, and climate change can feel abstract in space and time because of the long time scale on which we experience it. And so I wanted to write this book to kind of ground that abstract reality in kind of the very tangible day-to-day. So my book, I write about the internet and technology, food, fashion, and fuel.
It's always, when I started, I felt like a useful lodestar, which I have not stuck to. But just thinking through what I myself found interesting and what I reacted to, it's like climate change is a very interesting problem. Like, it's very bad, but it's so fascinating.
Right.
And energy, it gets there.
Yeah.
Like, it gets to be interesting.
Yeah. To put in a lot more time for it to be interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And that gap between climate change being so interesting and wanting the need to react to it is so visceral. And then, like, you start down that path.
Right.
And kind of very quickly you find yourself reading about, like, regional electricity markets.
Right.
In
or
Maryland.
A specific co-op grid structure in Texas. And
yes.
How did I get here?
Like power purchasing agreements
right.
versus. Do you think there's a way? Can I ask you to read a section of your book?
Sure.
Is that cool?
Yeah.
It's just the
I
end.
think there is a way to make it interesting. Hopefully, I've done it in the book. But,
yes, she has done. And I think the question is. You have a section at the end of the introduction. Maybe just which is page 8, which I can hand you the book.
Yeah,
for
what is it, like the last paragraph or something on that page?
Yeah, because I think it gets at the ideas here.
Okay.
Or maybe the end of the page. I mean, I think wherever you think that passage is kind of the best place to start.
Okay.
But maybe no matter what happens.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. So in the introduction, I kind of talk a little bit about my answer to the last question, and kind of hopefully setting up the book. Okay. No matter what happens, we are going to have to continue to fight to make a difference. The changes we need are big and complicated, and a lot of special interests are aligned against progress. So, and I wrote about the people who were elected in the midterm elections. So these new elected officials might not be able to make them happen right away. We might not change the entire electrical grid in one session of Congress, but that's no reason not to start. Making even small changes will definitely be much better than where we are. And better might not be perfect, but better is good. As citizens, we have a responsibility to put environmentally progressive leaders in office. But it can't end there. We have to know enough to make sense of what they're offering, know if it's actually what needs to get done, and to hold them accountable for their actions. If we want to have clean electricity, grow food, manufacture goods, and get around responsibly, we have to understand what it will take to get there, and we have to make it happen. Creating a context to understand those issues is what I've tried to do in this book, mainly by talking about our stuff. It's up to us to create a country that takes seriously its obligations to the planet, to each other, and to the people who will be born into a world that looks different than ours has for the last 10,000 years or so. If we aren't paying attention, others with destructive intentions or different motivations might make the decisions for us. Essentially, what I'm describing is hard work with possibly limited success for the rest of your life. But we have to do it, and at least we will have the satisfaction of knowing we made things better. I hope this book can help, because if we don't get started now, the world ends and the rats take over. That's a joke. Come on, it will be fun.
Essentially, what I'm describing is hard work with possibly limited success for the rest of your life. I was like, oh, someone's put this political awareness that you kind of eventually come to as an environmental reporter into writing. And I circled it. And let's back up, though.
Okay.
In looking at all these different parts of the environment and all these different parts of the economy, really, was there one thing that was the most surprising in terms of what its environmental impact was? Was there one section or product or good?
Well, I was really interested to learn kind of about, well, that the internet had any kind of environmental impact at all. And I think that's probably just because I wasn't paying attention to how the internet worked. But I think, you know, part of some of the language that we use to discuss it is kind of, you know, we talk about the cloud or it's wireless, and we kind of carry around these devices in our pocket, but, you know, the devices themselves are, you know, very closely connected to the world. I mean, they're made from materials that are mined all over the world and shipped all over the world. And there's some statistic like, you know, your iPhone travels over 600,000 miles before it gets to you, just from where all the different pieces come from. But, you know, and also just that the internet itself uses electricity, and because it's on and running all the time, and what a physical system that is, and how, you know, we may not be aware that, you know, for me living in New York, if I'm doing something online, it's possibly creating the demand for fossil fuels to be burned in another part of the country, and sort of understanding how we all fit into these bigger systems with our small actions was, it was a kind of very powerful and good example of what I'm trying to do in the book, which is to say, you know, that we, whether or not we're aware of these systems or our participation in them, we're, you know, we're involved, and so we have the opportunity to shape them either by the way that we use our systems or how we apply pressure on corporations or governments or whoever else is in charge.
And you don't just write about Bitcoin.
And
either.
I don't, yes, I know, shocking.
It feels like that has, for whatever reason, I mean, noticing in your book, you seem to be responding to the same thing I've noticed, which is for some reason, Bitcoin, which is just one kind of computing, seems to dominate our conversations about all the environmental impacts of all computing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if people here are familiar with that, but there's like kind of every couple months, I feel like a new study that says that Bitcoin mining uses as much electricity as Ireland or something like that, which is, you know, significant in and of itself, but I think it kind of misses the larger point, which is that the way that we use data, you know, from streaming video, which is streaming video takes up about 70% of internet bandwidth, and it's only growing. And an amazing statistic from a study that I write about in the book is there's a study that was comparing, you know, the relative efficiency of streaming video versus buying or renting a DVD. And in 2011, streaming a video was much more efficient. And we watched, in that year, 3.2 billion hours of video. In 2017, we watched 114 billion hours of video. So the way that we're using data and how much data we're using is just growing so much. And I think that often gets obscured in this fascination with Bitcoin, as does, you know, the growth of AI or self-driving cars, all of which have, you know, tremendous data needs too.
Something that was surprising to me was the fact that basically every big data center just has dozens of diesel generators basically on site to keep them open.
Yeah. So when we're talking about kind of data storage or why this matters, so data centers, they're kind of most of the internet now is stored in these big kind of cloud computing centers or hyperscale data centers. About a third of the internet is hosted by Amazon Web Services. But we can talk about that later if we want. But basically, these servers they're on and they're using electricity all the time to send and receive data. But also they get really, really hot, and so they need to be kept cool. So that's another reason why they use a lot of electricity. But to make sure that there kind of aren't gaps in service from a blackout or whatever, they all have diesel generators. So it was difficult for me to square that with the fact that a lot of the companies that host so much of the internet, like Amazon or Google or Microsoft, have a lot of claims about their renewable energy and that they're carbon neutral or whatever, and then they have diesel generators.
And like AT&T.
Yeah, and AT&T is the
biggest.
It's the biggest. I think it's ozone or PM2.5. Particulate matter. AT&T is the largest polluter of particulate matter in the Bay Area.
And particulate matter just is the really bad one.
Yeah, that's the really bad one, and that's the one that comes from burning diesel, which also happens at hospitals and airports and train stations and all. Not that those things should have more of a license to pollute, but those things can't happen. I mean, we don't know how to run those things not using diesel at the moment, whereas we do know how to kind of create electricity without it. So, I think the polluting impacts are really, and the energy needs of the internet are really kind of underappreciated and overlooked.
Is there? I hate to make you ask this question. When you look at the various data companies. Mm-hmm. All the big tech companies, I think at this point, have some version of a renewable promise. Mm-hmm. Is there one that's doing a good job or doing a better job? Is there, do you think some of those, it seems from your book some are better than others.
Yeah, well there's some, Greenpeace has been ranking kind of the kind of big internet companies, in terms of where they are in terms of clean energy and transparency and all these other metrics. And Apple and Google have done better over the years, and Google I think is the largest purchaser of solar power in the Netherlands or something like that. Amazon is the worst.
Sunny place.
Yeah, right. Amazon historically has been the worst. I mean, they just a couple weeks ago released their carbon footprint for the first time. I mean, of the overall company, not just the internet, and it would put them kind of in the top 10 or maybe 11 of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases in the United States, and that includes oil companies and natural gas companies, and so and the web services is a part of that as well. And they in general, I mean, they've built some renewable facilities, but because they've only just released their carbon footprint, it's been really difficult to understand if they're actually kind of doing what they say.
Moving across all the topics in your
yeah.
book, is there? Well, actually, let's just move to fashion. Mm-hmm. What should we know when thinking about fashion? Buying clothes.
Well, fashion was reading about or researching that and writing about it was really interesting for me also because it was. I mean, there's not the same kind of data available as there is about food or fuel or even Bitcoin or some other parts of the internet. But
what do you think that is? Just to.
I think part of it is, my kind of pet theory is, because it's something that women have been interested in, it's not been taken as seriously or kind of given the same kind of scientific consideration, and because it's, I don't know, associated with vanity or something like that. But it's kind of amazing because it's an industry that touches, plant agriculture, animal agriculture, mining, forestry, petrochemicals, and it's has been one of the drivers of globalization, as well as, the Industrial Revolution was kind of started to make textiles. So it's it is surprising that there's so little data, and it made it kind of more difficult to write about. But the most interesting thing that I learned about was writing about cheap cashmere, which was something I didn't think that I was going to write about because it's relatively niche. But I'll just tell the story of why it matters. Yeah. So basically, we have over the last 20 or 30 years, the availability of cashmere in the US and companies like Uniqlo and lots of others have caused the goat population in Mongolia and China, where most of the cashmere comes from, to skyrocket. And it's difficult to get a precise estimate of the goat population in Mongolia, but in 1990, before the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Japanese recession and China opening up even more to global trade, there were about 5 million goats in Mongolia. Now there are 24 million goats, or in 2004 there were 24 million goats, and they represent about 60% of the livestock there. So it's really, and then they live in a landscape or ecosystem that's incredibly, it's extreme, but also is very delicate. And so the goats, when they graze, they eat the whole plant, so they pull up the roots, which destabilizes the soil. And then they have really sharp hooves, which further breaks up the soil, so it adds to the already occurring process of desertification. And additionally, this part of the world is experiencing climate change at a faster rate than most of the rest of the world. So if the average surface temperature of the Earth has warmed by about 1 degree Fahrenheit, Mongolia is about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's getting a lot hotter and drier, which is also exacerbating this process of desertification.
And this is like the Gobi?
Yeah, this is like the high mountain prairie near the Gobi, but yeah, becoming the Gobi. So it adds about 1,000 square miles of desert every year. So that's like Mongolia. That's like adding Rhode Island of desert to this desert. And then that dust from that has kind of been blown across gets further blown across to Beijing and other kind of cities farther east, where it combines with the kind of air pollution from coal-fired power plants and factories, and so adds to the air pollution in those cities. And then in another 5 days, it comes to the west coast of the US. And so about 40% of air pollution in California can be attributed to dust from Chinese factories. And of course, there's dust from the desert. So it was, another really kind of succinct and kind of perfect example of what I'm trying to do, which is, I think we think of our clothes as kind of very intimate and belonging to us, and then all of a sudden I'm interacting with not only the life of a nomadic goat herder, but somebody in China who's suffering from air pollution, and somebody in LA, just from kind of buying a scarf. And so it was, I think, a really good example of how our actions and our goods don't exist in a vacuum, and they are really interconnected.
You described this other global chain like that when talking about energy, which is so the Kyoto Protocol allowed wood burning.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's so. I feel like I'm getting on and off the subway. We've lost our timer, but we're doing great. It's really timed so well to blow up every time I'm ready to formulate this new syntax in my brain. The Kyoto Protocol had this clause in it, and of course, the Kyoto Protocol, I think even for the countries that observed it, is not even in force anymore. It ended maybe, but it had this force that basically allowed you to burn wood.
Yeah, so basically, the Kyoto Protocol, which was an international climate agreement before Paris, I think in the late 90s, which we actually, the US never ratified. So the IPC, one of the early IPCC reports counted emissions from forestry, so cutting down trees, as land use emissions. And then the Kyoto Protocol counted burning wood for electricity as renewable. And so basically what's happened is that Europe has this renewable standard where they have to get 20% of their electricity from renewables by 2020. But they're basically getting half of their renewable electricity from wood, much of which they're importing from the US, specifically from the American Southeast. And so it's kind of old growth and hardwood trees are being cut down to produce that, but also kind of pine plantations are replacing those and to create wood pellets that then get shipped. Ours mainly get shipped to England to be burned, and the power plants that burn them get all kinds of subsidies for renewable energy, but burning wood is less efficient than burning coal, causes more pollution. None of the emissions are counted. And I mean, it's renewable in that you can plant more trees, but the rate at which the trees absorb the carbon dioxide really doesn't kind of account for all the emissions that have been created or produced burning the wood for electricity. So that was a really, and not to mention that creating wood pellets here is incredibly energy intensive and polluting, and there's very little oversight from the EPA on these wood pellet factories, and there are like.
And where are they? They're in the southeast.
They're mainly in the southeast. Like I think that there's something like there are 25 pellet plants, and there are like 12 more scheduled for production. And this is an industry that has basically been created in between the late 90s and now. But yeah, much of the kind of forestries, like North Carolina, Virginia, that part of the country, and then a lot of the pellet plants are in Texas and also in North Carolina. There's a lot going on tonight.
So it's, we described like these big chains, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like sheep cashmere requires big goat herds,
Right.
leads to sand pollution, like sand air pollution in California, or like European subsidy schemes inherited from like a dead climate treaty lead to felling old growth forests in Virginia. Right. Yeah, so what should we do about that?
Well, I think, it's, I don't know. No, I mean, I think that this is one of the reasons why, it's been a kind of difficult message in some ways to get across, to, have written a book that's mainly kind of about consumer goods and relates to individual behavior, and then make the argument that individual behavioral changes are not going to fix this problem. But I really think that, when you think about these systems and how all these things work together, you can see that, me buying one fewer cashmere sweater doesn't fix the system. And so we really need to kind of think about where we're applying our efforts and what are the most effective ways for change to happen. And I think that happens from, government regulation and corporate responsibility. And neither of those things is currently happening. So I mean, in the book, or people ask me, well, what can I do? And I think in that way, voting is the most important thing to do, and also either putting pressure on companies or not supporting companies that aren't at the very least transparent about their practices. And I think that kind of pressure actually really does matter or can matter.
And like corporate social responsibility, like actually kind of does matter too, like that can affect the flows.
Yeah, well, I mean, for fashion in particular, a lot of these companies will kind of, it'll be pointed out to them that they're doing something really terrible, and then they'll say, well, we just get that from our suppliers, and so there's kind of a lack of accountability throughout the supply chain. But, I think fundamentally, we've put too much of the burden on the consumer to make the sustainable choice when we don't have any access to the information that would allow us to make that decision for the most part. And so, it shouldn't be up to me to figure out kind of which, if there's a responsible cashmere, like which of the sweaters is better, or, where I write about denim in the book, like which pair of jeans was made using the least amount of water. Like, it's impossible for me to know that from just standing in the store, but somebody does know that, and that's the company who's or they can get that information. And so, so I think that's why the kind of burden for these changes has to come at those levels, because if you eliminate the unsustainable options, then nobody has to make that choice. So I think like light bulbs are a good example of that, whereas like if you don't sell incandescent bulbs, then nobody has to make the choice about whether or not they should buy LED or incandescent, or and so I think some companies are waking up to that. I think a lot of what we're seeing, especially in fashion, is kind of just carbon neutral. So they're buying offsets for like their fashion shows rather than kind of meaningfully changing their supply chain.
Do you think offsets work?
Do you think offsets work?
I was asking the question.
You know,
Boy, I think someone needs to figure it out.
I know. Well, I think, I mean, it's so hard because, I mean, obviously, kind of emissions doesn't account for the full environmental impact of something,
Yeah.
which, you know, even for something like airplane travel. You know, at the same time, we don't really have a lot of substitutes for jet fuel. So, you know, in that way, I think offsetting, you know, it's kind of the least that you can do in a way. But, you know, and there are ways to get ones that are better than others. But I think, I mean, I think that people probably have been treating it like a kind of get out of jail free card, or that they can pollute more because they're buying offsets. And I don't really think that that's how it works. Not only because, you know, again, like you can't pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at the same rate that you're putting it in by planting trees, but also because it doesn't account for kind of all these other consequences of different methods of production.
What's the conversation missing, other than your book? Your book. Like, what's the conversation about climate change that we mostly have, like, missing right now?
Well, I do think that, you know, I think people are kind of starting to recognize it more, hopefully. But I think that there is this tension between, you know, feeling powerless and feeling like you want to do something in the face of this enormous crisis, and the kind of level of activity in your daily life doesn't match that. But, you know, I think that's why, you know, I wrote this book that kind of emphasizes these systems, and also, you know, I think the idea that we don't need to feel individually guilty about climate change, but we need to feel collectively responsible about fixing it. And you know, I think there's also, like, I kind of get frustrated. I don't know if you feel the same way when we hear things like, well, we only have 11 years to fix it. And because I think that allows for the possibility, like, well, if we don't do it in 11 years, then like, whatever, you know, like we missed our chance, and so therefore we don't have to do anything. But also, you know, it's never too late to reduce emissions. There, you know, and there's always something to be done. And I think also a sense of complacency means that, you know, there are people around the world who are suffering from climate change at the moment, or from fossil fuel pollution at the moment, and you know, that they're disproportionately you know, communities of color in this country, you know, the global South, indigenous communities, and to not be doing anything at these levels that something needs to be done, I think means that, you know, we're okay with that level of suffering for those people right now. It's not some kind of abstract timeline that we're thinking on.
Is that the idea that we're not guilty, individually guilty for climate change, but we are collectively responsible? Like, is that the one? Are there other ideas like that you wish you could just, like, say every 2020 candidate down and be like, here's how we should be, like,
yeah, well, I mean, I think you
beyond
know,
the fact that it's real, and
right,
you know,
right,
if
yeah.
Trump was there,
blah,
you know,
blah, blah.
yeah.
No, I think, you know, I think that's really important, because I think it, you know, lets those, I mean, in addition to kind of the other things that we've talked about, like, it lets those who are actually responsible off the hook.
Yeah.
And I think also makes people kind of turn inward away from the problem if they're only focusing on their individual behavior.
Do you think the stat that we hear about, like, 20 companies are responsible for most of the emissions, like, it's kind of, it's an accurate statistic if you understand the methodology. Do you think it's a true statistic?
Well, I think there are so many other impacts beyond, I mean, obviously that's kind of the most pressing in a way, is the greenhouse gas emissions, but I think that there are so many other impacts that we're not thinking about when we think about, you know, fossil fuel pollution and extraction, that, you know, one of the things I write about in the book is about coal ash pollution, which is the byproduct of burning coal for electricity, which is something that we don't, I mean, I had never heard about it before I became a climate and environment journalist, but, you know, it's the byproduct of burning coal for electricity. It's one of the largest solid industrial waste streams in the US.
What does it look like?
It's like dust. It's like soot, kind of. But we mostly store it in water, so then it's kind of sludgy. But it contains, arsenic, mercury, lead, selenium, cadmium, kind of all the, other substances that are harmful to human health. Yeah.
Yeah, the good metal.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's stored kind of in every single state. And in 2008, there was a dam of this, a pond that contained a lot of this coal ash slurry in Tennessee that broke, and it released billions and billions of gallons of this material into a river and buried 300 acres of land. It was cleaned up and carted away to a landfill outside a predominantly black community in Alabama. The workers who cleaned it up weren't given any protective equipment, and they've recently just won a lawsuit against the contractor for the health problems that many of them have had, and many workers have also died as a result of illnesses from there. But I'd never heard of it again before I became a reporter on this subject, and even though that was one of the biggest environmental disasters in American history, and it happened in 2008, and I think that's part of the problem, which is it's a luxury to not have to know what coal ash is, because there are millions of people who live with it every day. And again, they're disproportionately low-income communities of color and in rural communities. And they're dealing with the health effects of having this material that seeps into their groundwater, or they breathe it in the air. And so, I think, if we're talking about getting rid of coal, that's great from a climate perspective. This waste, it will always be there. And I feel like we kind of, actually Illinois passed a law in July addressing coal ash pollution. But, I think that there are kind of really these kind of deep historical concerns, from pollution and the inequities there. And in terms of inequity, I think also we need to, if I could talk to the 2020 candidates, I would tell them, to focus on these issues of transitional justice and bring along the communities that feel like they're being threatened by these changes. Whether that's fossil fuel workers or fishermen who might be affected by an offshore wind farm or something like that.
We're about to go to questions, so start formulating your question in your head as a wonderful reminder that a question ends in a question mark. But first, what are we, if the two things that matter are the government and corporations, and we need to bring along public knowledge, are there forms of, power that are missing? Should we focus a lot on policy, but should we be paying more attention? Should there be groups, maybe it's Greenpeace, that focus just on companies, or what could bring this kind of systems level knowledge into our politics? I don't know either.
Right. No, I think that there are some of these environmental organizations that have been paying attention to this stuff, but I don't know that they've been communicating that they're doing that, and that may be part of the problem. But I think it also requires, us as consumers and voters to kind of be more conscious of where the things that we're using come from. And I don't know how you organize around that, but I feel like, not like knowledge is power, but but I do think that kind of understanding these systems really does kind of change perceptions about what is necessary.
It seems like there's this paradox where we know green consumerism basically is not at all equal to the challenge.
Right.
But there needs to be some other way of looking at this, which isn't just I bought this thing, so I'm fine.
Right.
But I'm paying attention to what I'm buying and kind of choosing the better companies here, or I'm getting my business to choose the better companies here. We need to unite this systems view and this consumer view, which normally I don't think we ever kind of think about
No.
necessarily in a consumer,
Yeah.
like when we're thinking about our consuming choices.
No, I don't think we do either, and that's like one of the things that I've been really impressed by with the youth climate strike is that they do understand that these changes need to happen on like a systemic and structural level. But it is, it is kind of amorphous and difficult to kind of organize around consciousness, or kind of knowledge of a problem. But yeah, I agree that we need to. When we talk about policy and climate change, we really only focus on energy, and I think that's kind of like, at our own peril. Do we kind of forget about all these other things that actually really do matter?
If there was one system that folks here should be paying attention to, that's not energy, what would it be?
Well, I think the food system, as I'm sure many people are aware, is one of the biggest global contributors of greenhouse gases, and so of course that matters a lot, and there are lots of pollution concerns associated with food production also. But I don't know. I think.
And it's good because we haven't talked about it at all.
Yeah, we
so
haven't
they
talked about
have
it at
to
all.
go to
Yeah,
your book.
exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's one I think kind of that has the biggest impact. But it's hard for me to choose.
No, yeah, exactly. Cool. Let's go to questions.
Oh, I think we have the mics
Yeah.
set up.
So. Yes, there's mics set up in the aisles.
My name is Aman. I'm a first-year MPP public policy student here at Harris School. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. So my question is around the role of communication around climate change. So while we know that there is a growing evidence around the impact of human impact on climate change, and you have touched based on the need to address this issue from the supply side top-down approach. So even still, there is a need to increase greater awareness on the impact of climate change at the individual level, and also need to. So, what role communication, or I would say journalism, can play in order to internalize these environment-related externalities at the individual level, so that there is an expedition in the towards a sustainable path.
I guess beyond writing about it and talking about it, I think we do. There probably needs to be a shift also from. I think so much of the journalism kind of focuses on like disasters, and which are really important, and then sort of energy policy, and again that there's so much kind of left out in between that I think not only is really important, but also makes people understand. It kind of brings it down to the scale of our own lives, and so I think that's what I've tried to do in the book, and I think that we kind of need more of that. But I don't know, what do you think?
I think it's really hard because there's nothing like national news to generate attention, and at the same time, there's lots of stories published in the national news on not this set of topics and not what I would say this systemic worldview always necessarily, but only do national news events kind of focus us and do the work that we think of communications as doing. I think journalism could be doing a lot more around this kind of stuff.
I guess I think also bringing it up when you have a story about something that seems unrelated with climate, and not every time you have the Super Bowl you should talk about the carbon footprint of the Super Bowl, but the kind of the energy use associated with all these different things and kind of how sustainable they are, I think is important, because that of course matters too, and maybe would help people kind of understand these different events and these different impacts and context.
I would say, not to popcorn back, but the thing, we're answering this as climate reporters and environmental reporters, and my biggest wish is that we had more politics reporters and fashion reporters and car reporters, and there are ways, the understanding climate change as a systemic thing, lots of people in the media and in communications understand it's a big deal and understand they want to do something about it, but they don't have that in-depth knowledge that you can get again from purchasing the book outside. And they tend to think of it as just like a few things. So just an example, like in the last debate for the Democratic primary candidates, there were no climate questions, and there had just been like 7 hours of prime time and like Forum and CNN talking about climate questions, and I kind of like, so on the one hand, I understand why that happened. On the other hand, they were in Ohio, where I think still like half of all the electricity comes from coal, but where at the same time, the coal use is plummeting. Like it was 57% 2 years ago, and now it's 47%. So like those are policy decisions, and those like really affect people's lives, but we don't think, and it has a huge climate angle because utilities are not great actors in this story, but they are like ditching coal because they're worried about carbon regulation eventually. So that's a climate story, and yet none of the candidates were asked it. So I think my biggest wish would be like that more reporters and just like more people involved in politics generally kind of had this systemic view of the issue that was like the same way they think about the economy.
This side? No. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Natika. I'm a public policy student as well. I just wanted to ask, go back to the fundamental question of whether conscious consumerism can help solve the problem. What can we do, aside from voting, as consumers in our day-to-day lives?
I think, again, I mean, I try to, in a way, kind of resist putting so much emphasis on the individual behavior because, again, I do think it's so hard to make the kind of sustainable, ethical choice all the time, given the information that we have and kind of what our options are. But I think some of the things that you've heard are true. I mean, like beef production, dairy. I mean, those have big climate impacts. Or flying. I mean, the things that I think that we kind of are aware of as having a big climate impact. I mean, those things are true. But I do kind of I don't resist it, but I guess I want to emphasize always that those are great things to do because they're good things to do. But I don't want kind of people to think, and not that this is what you're saying, but that like therefore like once they do that, they're done. And more that it is broader than we understand that as the beginning of kind of how we engage with this topic.
Are there ways you changed your life in the process of writing the book?
Well, yes. I mean, there are some. I mean, I eat so much yogurt, so that's very hard for me. But I don't like cook red meat. I don't eat it at home. I rarely eat it in restaurants. I do offset my travel when I fly, offset my book tour. I don't order things online, or I try not to. And if I do, then I don't do like 2-day shipping or next day delivery for reasons that you'll read about in the e-commerce chapter. But I think overall I try to consume less. I get a lot of satisfaction just from like looking at clothes online rather than buying them. Which made it very difficult for me to figure out what to wear on my book tour. But in general, I think I do kind of just I buy less, buy fewer things. And especially with clothing, I think that's. One of the best things to do is kind of buy things that last and wear them, or to buy secondhand, or to rent clothing if that's an option.
Okay, so I'm the third public policy student. Here's the question. So you said do offsets work? That's what started essentially that's what got me thinking. And I remember in all our classes, when you ask questions like that, the answer is a stereotypical, it depends. Because climate change lies at the intersection of science, economics, politics at the moment. So I don't think there exists a single answer. And as climate reporters, my question to you is, when you do talk to experts and you want to get their opinions, how do you distill that into a message that a general audience can understand And also, what makes you most hopeful, and how comfortable are you with the idea of inevitability that you talked about? Because it's a reality now.
Yeah. I think it's very hard to kind of, I mean, it always does depend, and it always is contingent. And as, you know, I think the inevitability question is I mean, some warming and some of the trends are kind of baked into the system given how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases we've already put into the atmosphere. But at the same time, you know, in terms of making projections, what we decide to do is kind of the biggest variable in making all these projections. So, but basically, like, it's really hard to distill it, and so I wrote a book instead. But no, I mean, I do think that I think it's a disservice to answer, like, do offsets work with a yes or no, because it does depend, and I think it's important to understand how complicated this is, because, you know, if we don't understand that, then it's like, well, why can't we just offset everything, or if it's so easy, or why can't we just switch to renewables if that's what needs to happen? And understanding how complicated and interdependent these systems are, and that there are always trade-offs kind of no matter what. You know, I think that it is important to explain that, and I think that's a big, important part of our role as journalists. I think, I mean, I am hopeful, or I kind of try to have faith in humanity after things like the youth climate movement, I think, is really kind of inspiring. We were talking about before, just the fact that they went from, you know, not that Greta was the only one, but, you know, that she went from being alone to leading a march of 7 million people around the world in a year is really amazing. So that makes me feel somewhat better. But yeah, and in terms of the inevitability, I mean, I think we're headed for a certain amount of warming, kind of no matter what.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Annalise Wagner. I'm also a public policy student. We're taking over tonight. And
is there any other major at UChicago?
I'm not here, apparently. So we are all at the Harris School very interested in data. So my question is, what data are missing in this conversation, either that you came across as you were writing the book that you wish that you had, or that you just think companies should be releasing for us to have a full understanding of their impact?
I think that again, there's a lot of data missing from fashion, and there are two statistics that are often repeated about the fashion industry. One is, like, it's 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, and two, that it's the second most polluting industry in the world. And I couldn't find any data to back up either one of those things. So I think it is an industry that's incredibly important to measure. You know, I think, I don't know, I mean, there's so many things. I think, like, really specifically, I think there's not a lot of temperature readings from the southern oceans.
Yes, that's yeah.
So that's really important in lots of parts of
scientific data.
Yeah, but in lots of parts of the kind of the oceans in particular that are hard to monitor and so important. You know, I think you just wrote a story today about ocean acidification.
I did.
Yeah. And kind of how some of the other mass extinctions all included some level of ocean acidification. So, you know, that's another area that we really need to pay more attention to. And you know, I think in terms of how we use data, I think it's really important to understand that data also, and as I'm sure you know, but I think in this area in particular, like, inherits the biases of the people who make them, or who collect the data or produce the algorithms. And so, you know, I think, again, like, and a lot of this is produced and studied in the global north, and so we have a bias towards our part of the world. And I think we kind of need to look more at the rest of the world, too.
Hi, I'm Aaron. I'm not a public policy student. So I thought it was interesting that you finished with talking about how to get this more into politics. John Kerry was here a couple of weeks ago, and he actually talked about that being a frustration of his in launching, I think soon, the World War Zero initiative to get people to vote, hopefully, especially young people, to try and change it from the political side. One of the things that I struggle with in having conversations with my friends and colleagues, as well as the leader of the company that I used to work with, was actually not just using more and more evidence and piles of information that I think we already have about this, but actually getting somebody's mind to change. So in your experience after having written this and talking to people, whether it's just friends of yours or leaders that are city leaders or University of Chicago, which doesn't have a specific date to get to carbon neutral yet, have you found that the vignettes have been helpful as you have that conversation, or what's been your sort of takeaway after having started this tour?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think if you're not already convinced by a chart, I don't think that's going to do a lot for you. I think in general people respond to stories, and that's kind of as humans, that's how we understand the world, is making a narrative out of it. So I think that is really powerful. I think, also, we don't have to talk about climate science to talk about the issue, and I think that's kind of the mistake that people make a lot of the time. I mean, for a farmer in this part of the country who, lost a crop because of the flooding this year, it doesn't necessarily matter why that happened, but it matters that happened to that person, and I think also kind of making it clear that this is a problem that affects all of us, and so we have to do something about it. Wouldn't you want to make it so that flood isn't as bad, or your kids don't have to deal with that, or whatever it is, rather than kind of trying to beat somebody over the head with the idea that precipitation will be more extreme precipitation events in the next decade or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you agree, but I think there are ways to kind of bring people around to the ways in which we're all affected by this that don't necessarily involve trying to convince somebody that the world is warming on a particular time frame.
Yeah, I guess I think I definitely agree that for a while it seemed. I think the enterprise of science thought it had a problem. I thought it, scientists and science policy leaders and kind of science celebrities were oh no, people don't believe in climate change, they don't believe science. And I think in the past 10 years, we've gotten past that, and they've realized, in fact, people like science. They basically still believe in science. They just think scientists are wrong about climate change. And by the way, in the past 15 years, nutritional science has completely reversed its position on fats and sugars. So it's not there's no, I would not, as a science reporter, say believe everything scientists say. It's just that there's a particularly good set of evidence for this. I think an underrated, if we're talking about getting it in politics more, I totally agree that there's a lot of climate policy that doesn't need to announce itself as climate policy, particularly in the adaptation space. And I also think that people are drawn to interestingness and interesting problems and interesting things to think about, and a possible way to break the dam, especially with business leaders and with folks in power who are kind of sensible generally and are not driven to believe one thing because that's what their team believes. There's a lot of interesting kind of questions and things with climate change, and even questions that we don't know how to answer yet about how we're going to fix it. So that seems like a ripe area.
Yeah, and probably health also, I think, because especially with air pollution, there's so much overlap between fossil fuel emissions and deaths and illness from air pollution. So, that's another way that's probably even a better example than flooding from climate change of how you could get people to care who might not otherwise care, which is your kid is maybe getting asthma, or you're getting this lung disease, and so don't you? I mean, and that has much more immediate term impacts than changing what happens with flooding and things like that. So I think there are ways to appeal to what people care about that again, that aren't obviously related to climate change or climate science.
It does, something I was struck by reading your book is in some ways politically it feels like environmental advocates have given up on conventional environmentalism early. There's still a ton of just bad toxic stuff.
Right, and usually the stuff that's good for people is good for the planet, you know. I think there's just so much pollution that is kind of that doesn't necessarily kind of I mean, water pollution from industry and all these sorts of things that don't necessarily seem like directly tied to climate particularly, but all these things kind of work together.
Like burning fossil fuels.
It's bad for people.
It's bad.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah,
the fumes are bad.
Right. Well,
even with catalytic converters,
right.
Still bad.
Well, and that's, I think that's another problem with how we've talked about climate change, which is like we often frame it in terms of like sacrifice and loss and what we'll have to give up. And I think we also should think about it as an opportunity. If like we don't burn fossil fuels, no one has to suffer from the effects of fossil fuel pollution. So I think there are a lot of kind of ways that this is better for everybody.
My name is Susan. I'm not a student at all. I'm interested in consumer behavior collectively and how kind of economic dislocations happen. But this is probably, I got to thinking about this when you said that Amazon has a really big footprint. Mm-hmm. And you may have covered this in your e-commerce chapter. I'm interested in the analysis that went into something like that. Okay, so half of the people I know don't buy paper or pet food or toilet paper at a store anymore. They order it. I can't get around to that. But I just wondered, when you looked into this, did you do any kind of analysis of, so Amazon is X amount of emissions, this, that, and that, but there's something else that isn't happening anymore because fewer people are doing these other kinds. Did you analyze the difference between those different kinds of shopping trips, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't do that work myself, but there are lots of studies that kind of look at, maybe somebody's not driving to the store or driving to the movie theater or whatever, but then they watch 10 movies at home, or whatever it is. That there are kind of different ways in which we use energy and resources. But in terms of e-commerce, and I think with e-commerce specifically. And I guess the video streaming is a good example of like we just stream a lot more video than like we even used to watch TV. With e-commerce, it could be much more efficient to order things online because these logistics companies are much better at planning a route that uses the least amount of fuel because that's a big overhead for them. But we kind of ruin that with 2-day shipping and next-day delivery because then the truck has to go out half full, half empty, depending on how you look at it. But to make the delivery in that shorter time window, as when I said I wanted it, as opposed to kind of when it makes most sense. So there are different kind of trade-offs and different rebound effects for all these different things.
And are we buying more?
Well, I mean, e-commerce has quadrupled over the last 10 years, but I don't know. I don't know if we're buying more in general. We have time for 3 more questions.
I am also not an MPP student. I'm an alum and currently working in biophysics here. And so my question is, you obviously did a lot of research for this book. Did you research how producing your own book would affect climate change? And what do you think the role is of people who are more indirectly related to producing?
I did not. I mean, I didn't write about paper in general. And I have thought about it, and it certainly is a trade-off, but I guess I feel that the information that I'm getting out there is hopefully worth it.
I'm definitely not against books, by the way.
No, I know. No, but I mean, I think that I feel like that's, people ask me like how I've changed my behavior and all that. I do feel like, I think we kind of, it's been like a tactic of deniers, not that this is what you're doing at all, but to kind of try to catch environmentalists out or, people who do this as hypocrites. And I do think that kind of this work is my way of contributing. And then the second question was, how people who are like adjacent to this. So what do you mean by that?
For instance, like people who either for instance, work in the oil industry who aren't currently at the top, they're not in charge of actually changing the system or anything like that.
Yeah.
What's their role? What can they do?
Well, I think it's really easy for me or for lots of people whose livelihood doesn't depend on that to say like we should shut down all these industries. And again, I think that that's a luxury, especially because we still need electricity, and our electricity at the moment comes from fossil fuels. And so, again, it's easy for me to sit here and say like we should ban fracking, but like realistically, what does that mean? And like whose jobs does that affect? And so I think it's I don't want to criticize anyone in general, but I think somebody who just works in oil isn't necessarily the problem, because like if you're from the Permian Basin, that's what people do there, and so that's why I think it's so important to invest in these ideas around transitional justice and kind of bringing these communities along, because it's not fair to take somebody's job away from them and not give them anything in return because we've shifted our policies. And so I think I think in Jay Inslee's plan when he was running for president, he had something like that 40% of renewable capacity or investment should happen in those sorts of communities. And I think that kind of thing is really important, and thinking about these these industries as like communities of people, as opposed to just like greedy villains twirling their mustaches.
I will say that if you labor markets are really important. I feel here I am at University of Chicago, so labor markets are important. But like companies are acting more progressive than the overall national atmosphere right now, because they need to get young people to come work for them in cities. And if you work at a company that is, has some outsized role in this, but you're not in leadership, like you do have more power internally.
Right, like when the Amazon employees were all threatening to go on strike, like that, makes a difference to the company. And I also think like, but there is a kind of disproportionate emphasis on like miners and like coal workers, and there are like 80,000 coal jobs in the U.S. Miners jobs. So, but it's like kind of outsized political impact and like narrative impact, and so at the same time, like there are just lots of it's complicated. It depends, basically.
Hi, my name is Lynn. I'm a public policy student. In your research, have you seen corporations react to consumers' demands for more sustainable practices? If not, do you have any thoughts on what's missing? Is that because the number of demands or requests has not reached like a critical mass? If yes, like, do you have any good examples of successful strategies or stories to share?
The companies that I wrote about in the book, a lot of them kind of started out as Patagonia, they're not, that's kind of their ethos as opposed to like responding to consumer demand, but they, have changed certain things or are looking into certain things based on problems that have been identified by consumers and others. So like one example is the microfiber plastic pollution from fleeces, which is like fleeces shed the most microplastic fibers of any material. And so it's like kind of ironic that Patagonia developed this material as a way to do something with plastic bottles, and now it's causing this kind of different kind of pollution. But that's something that they're trying to address, and they offer certain things like in their stores or methods that you can of how to wash your clothes without creating that sort of thing. I think in general there are companies that like maybe do one thing really well, but they haven't kind of across the board changed all of their behavior or their practices. Like I think Levi's has responded. I don't know if it's from consumer demand or from kind of industry pressure to use less water in producing their denim. And I've referred to that a few times. But so like producing a kilogram of cotton uses on average 2,500 gallons of water. Turning cotton into one pair of jeans can use up to 2,900 gallons of water. So it is a really huge amount of water. But Levi's they've started this program called Water Less, where they use less water. It's what it sounds like. But it's like technology that they've made available to other members of the industry and things like that. I guess, I don't know, do you have any?
Audacious not to call it water fewer.
Right.
Do I have anything? I think the AWS example is a good one.
Yeah.
A lot of that did come, like Amazon just had Jeff Bezos just had a press conference in DC, where you talked about Amazon's carbon footprint, and a lot of that was, some of that was driven by Amazon employees and customers kind of both pushing for recognition and for a change.
Yeah. So.
But it's not the strongest plan, so you know, that's when policy matters.
Yeah. Thanks. We have one more?
One more.
Question. Yeah, I'm an alum. I'm from Seattle, but I don't work for Amazon. My question is, what do you see as the sort of long-term effect of climate change in communities? I mean, I was interested, like one community, one part of the world, the temperature is up 1 degree, but another part of the world it's up 4 degrees, and I just see that as a recipe for, wars of competition for resources, for mass migration, and I just wonder what you think the hottest spots are right now for that, and what the future holds for just sort of political instability.
Hard to pick just one. An area that I'm really concerned about and interested in is the Arctic, because we're already seeing companies or shipping companies trying to send ships through in the summer because there's less Arctic sea ice, and soon there will be no summer sea ice, and shipping will become. I mean, it's inevitable, and there's kind of a scrambling for resources. Russia is building lots of port cities, and they're anticipating drilling for gas and oil in the Arctic. It's estimated that like 20% of the world's fossil fuel reserves are in the Arctic. I mean, it's not economical at the moment for us, but it could be for them. There are, I mean, as these more and more boats go through the Arctic, I mean, it is still very dangerous. We don't know what happens when oil gets under ice. The United States only has 2 ice-breaking ships. One of them is being harvested for parts. The other, all of the funding has been held. There was some funding allocated, but then it was redistributed to the wall. And again, like the Arctic is kind of is one of the last refuges for lots of mammals. And what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there. And so that's an area that I'm worried about in terms of kind of global competition, because China also wants to be a polar power. And it's changing incredibly quickly. And so I think, it's an area where international leadership really matters. And if I don't think we went to the Arctic Council, the last Arctic Council meeting. I don't think the U.S. attended.
I think we did, but I think Pompeo was supposed to stop in Greenland on his way back.
Yeah.
This is before the Greenland stuff, and he didn't.
Okay.
Because of something.
But anyway, like if we're not kind of setting the tone for what happens in the Arctic, then we're leaving it to Russia, basically. And so I think that's a really important area for us to pay attention to. Not only in terms of kind of the wildlife, but also, what happens there in terms of resources, and also there are a lot of indigenous communities in the Arctic also.
Tanya will be outside with books and signing. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Again. And
thank you all
for attending. And thank you all.